The Book of Job, a story of faith, suffering, and overcoming adversity. The Book of Job is one of the most profound and impactful accounts in the Bible. It leads us to reflect on themes that resonate with all of us: pain, faith, and God's justice. If you've ever wondered why bad things happen to good people or felt like you were facing trials without explanation, Job's story has much to teach. From the very first verses, we are introduced to a man of integrity, devoted to God, and greatly blessed. He had a large family, vast wealth, and was respected by all. However, his life takes a drastic turn when he unexpectedly loses everything. Job endures unimaginable suffering, not just physically, but also emotionally and spiritually. The impact of this story goes beyond sorrow and hardship. The Book of Job challenges us to rethink our understanding of God and the purpose of suffering. Why does God allow faithful people to go through difficult times? Does suffering always mean punishment, or can it be a test of faith? These are questions many of us have asked during moments of struggle. But what makes this story so powerful is how Job responds to his suffering. Even in the midst of his losses, he does not curse God. His journey teaches us that we may not always understand God's plans, but we can trust that He has something greater in store for us. Join us in exploring this incredible narrative and discover how Job faced his trials, how God answered his questions, and most importantly, how this story can transform the way we see life. Get ready for a reflection that can strengthen your faith and bring new perspectives on the challenges we face. Job, a man of integrity and blessings. Imagine a man who has everything: a loving family, wealth, respect, and a life of integrity before God. That was Job, a biblical figure known not only for his prosperity but, above all, for his unwavering faith. The Bible describes Job as a righteous, upright man who feared God, shunned evil, and always sought to do what was right. He lived in the land of Uz and was one of the wealthiest men of his time. To give you an idea, Job owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, along with a great number of servants. In other words, he was an extremely prosperous man, respected and admired by all. But his greatest treasure was not his material wealth, it was his large and blessed family. Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and they all lived in harmony. His children would often gather to celebrate and feast together, demonstrating the love and unity between them. What makes Job even more remarkable is his deep spiritual concern for his family. He had a habit of offering sacrifices to God regularly, asking for forgiveness for any sins his children might have committed, even unintentionally. This shows just how devoted he was to his faith, always interceding for those he loved. Job was not just a blessed man. He was a true example of faith and devotion. He recognized that everything he had came from God and lived in constant gratitude. Yet, his story teaches us that even the most righteous and faithful people can face unexpected trials. But how could a man so upright and devoted to God have his life turned upside down? This is the great question that leads us to one of the most powerful accounts in the Bible. Follow this journey and discover how Job's faith was tested to the extreme. Satan's challenge. Job's story takes an unexpected turn when an intriguing conversation unfolds between God and Satan. In the book of Job, we see that one day, the sons of God came to present themselves before him, and Satan also appeared among them. Then God asked, "Where have you come from?" And Satan answered, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." At that moment, God mentioned Job. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth. He is a man of integrity, who fears God and shuns evil." But Satan, always the accuser and skeptic, posed a challenge. Does Job fear God for nothing? Isn't it because you have placed a hedge of protection around him and given him everything he has? But stretch out your hand and strike all that he owns, and let's see if he doesn't curse you to your face. This was a direct accusation. According to Satan, Job's faithfulness existed only because he was prosperous and protected. In other words, Satan insinuated that Job's faith depended on the blessings he received rather than a genuine love for God. In response to this challenge, God allowed Job to be tested, but with a limit. "Very well, everything he has is in your hands, but do not lay a finger on his life." And so began the greatest trial of Job's life. A man of integrity and great blessings would now face a storm of loss and suffering that would put his faith to the ultimate test. What would happen next? Would Job remain faithful to God, or would he give in to despair? This story makes us reflect on our own faith. Do we trust God only when everything is going well? Or does our faith remain steadfast even in the most difficult times? Follow this journey and discover how Job endured this intense trial. The trials of Job. Job was a wealthy, respected man, full of blessings. He had many possessions, a large family, and a peaceful life. But suddenly, everything changed. In a single day, he lost everything. One after another, messengers arrived, bringing devastating news. The Sabaeans attacked and stole your oxen and donkeys, killing your servants. Fire fell from the sky and burned up your sheep and shepherds. The Chaldeans raided and took your camels. And then came the most painful blow of all. A strong wind struck the house where your children were gathered, and they all died. Faced with such overwhelming loss, anyone would have crumbled. But Job's reaction was astonishing. He tore his clothes, shaved his head in mourning, fell to the ground, and declared, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Even in the midst of tragedy, Job chose to worship God. But Satan was not finished. He wanted to prove that Job's faith was fragile, so he asked for permission to attack him physically. God allowed it, with one condition: Job's life must be spared. Then, Job was afflicted with a terrible disease. Painful sores covered his body from head to toe. The suffering was unbearable, and he sat among the ashes, trying to ease his pain with broken pottery shards. At that moment, his wife, overwhelmed by grief and despair, said, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." But Job firmly responded, "You speak as a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God, and not trouble?" Even in the face of such trials, Job remained faithful. He did not understand why he was suffering so much, but he chose to trust in God. This part of Job's story challenges us. How do we respond when we face difficult times? Job teaches us that even when we don't have answers, we can choose to trust and worship God, knowing that He always has a purpose, even in the most painful situations. The dialogue with his friends. News of Job's misfortune spread quickly. 3 of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, heard what had happened and traveled to comfort him. But when they arrived, they were shocked. The wealthy, respected man was now unrecognizable, covered in sores, sitting among ashes. The sight was so painful that for 7 days and 7 nights, they did not say a single word. They simply wept with him. Then, Job broke the silence. In his deep sorrow, he lamented the day he was born. Why did I not perish at birth? Why must someone who suffers so much be forced to live? Job's pain was so overwhelming that he wished he had never existed. Seeing his despair, his friends began to speak. At first, they seemed to want to help, but soon, the tone of the conversation changed. A debate about suffering and God's justice began. Eliphaz, the first to speak, suggested that no one suffers without reason. To him, Job must have committed some sin because God does not punish the righteous. Bildad agreed, saying that if Job's children had died, perhaps they had been punished for their mistakes. But if Job was truly innocent, God would restore him. Zophar was even harsher. Job must have been hiding something because God never punishes more than a person deserves. To them, the logic was simple. If Job was suffering, it was because he had done something wrong. But Job refused to accept this explanation. He knew he was a man of integrity and could not understand why God had allowed so much suffering. In his anguish, he cried out, "Even if I were guilty, my pain would still be too great. Where is justice? I want to speak with God." This dialogue between Job and his friends is one of the most striking moments in the story. It represents one of humanity's greatest dilemmas. Why do the righteous suffer? Often, when someone goes through hardship, people try to find blame or offer simplistic answers, as if everything were easy to explain. But Job's story teaches us that not everything has a clear explanation and that, instead of judging, the best thing we can do is show compassion. Job's suffering was not over yet. But in the midst of his pain, he began to seek something deeper, a real encounter with God. God's response to Job. After so much suffering, questioning, and long debates with his friends, Job longed for an answer. He wanted to understand why he was going through all of this. He felt wronged and desired a direct encounter with God to express his pain and seek explanations. And then, God answered, but not in the way Job expected. From within a whirlwind, God spoke. God did not offer Job a direct explanation for his suffering. Instead, he asked questions that revealed his greatness and sovereignty over all things. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you make the sun rise? Can you control the sea? Have you entered the storehouses of snow? Can you guide the constellations in the sky? God led Job to reflect on the vastness of the universe, the complexity of creation, and the fact that there are mysteries far beyond human understanding. Faced with God's majesty, Job humbled himself. He realized that, despite all his suffering, he had no grounds to question the Creator of the universe. His pain was real, but his understanding was limited. So he responded, I had only heard about you before, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore, I repent in dust and ashes. Job recognized that God is sovereign and that humans cannot always comprehend his ways. But in the end, he had a true encounter with God, something far more valuable than all the answers he had been seeking. God's response to Job teaches us that even when we do not understand suffering, we can trust that He is in control of all things. He sees beyond what we can perceive, and in the right time, He reveals His purpose. The restoration of Job, faithfulness that brought reward. After everything Job had been through, loss, pain, and deep questioning, the moment of restoration finally arrived. God not only answered Job, but also restored his life in a remarkable way. First, God rebuked Job's 3 friends. They had spoken many wrong things about God and suffering, believing that Job was being punished for some hidden sin. But God made it clear that Job was a righteous man and instructed his friends to offer sacrifices to receive forgiveness. And then, something very special happened. Job prayed for his friends. Even after being criticized and judged by them, Job interceded on their behalf. This act of humility and love marked the beginning of his restoration. The Bible says that when Job prayed for his friends, God changed his fate and blessed him twice as much. If he had been wealthy before, now he had twice as many possessions. If he had 10 children before, God gave him 10 more to complete his family. If he had been respected before, now his honor was fully restored. Job lived for many years after his trial, enjoying health and prosperity. He saw his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren experiencing a full life filled with God's grace. The story of Job teaches us that suffering can be intense, but God is faithful and never abandons us. At the right time, He restores, heals, and gives us far more than we can imagine. Job's faithfulness was rewarded, and his story remains an inspiration for all who face hardships. Conclusion and final reflection. What can we learn from Job? The story of Job leads us to a deep reflection on life, faith, and suffering. He was a righteous man, God-fearing and greatly blessed, but suddenly he lost everything. His wealth, his children, and even his health were taken from him, and he found himself submerged in pain and sorrow. Yet, even without understanding God's plans, Job remained faithful. This teaches us something powerful. True faith does not depend on circumstances. Many times, we go through difficult moments, ask ourselves, why? And seek answers that may never come. But Job's story shows us that God has a greater purpose, even when we cannot see it. Did you like this content? If this video helped you, share it with someone who also needs to hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more videos like this one. And don't forget to leave your likes and comments below. May God bless you and your family. See you in the next video. Thank you so much.